The wind that swept across the high plains of the Dakota Territory had a will of its own, an almost conscious desire to strip the land of anything that dared to stand above the soil. It was not merely a movement of air, but a relentless physical entity that battered the sprawling prairies with the force of a frozen ocean. In the late 19th century, the settlers who pushed into this unforgiving expanse brought with them the building traditions of the sheltered eastern forests. They constructed their homes of wood, erecting square, defiant boxes upon the flat earth, attempting to conquer the landscape through sheer stubbornness and the burning of massive quantities of timber. They believed that thick walls and a red-hot iron stove were the only answers to the crushing weight of the winter. It was a hard-won piece of frontier wisdom, passed from neighbor to neighbor, that survival meant fighting the elements head-on, standing tall against the gales, and feeding the fire until the cast iron glowed in the dark. Yet, this conventional wisdom was fundamentally flawed, a reactive measure that misunderstood the true nature of the environment they sought to inhabit. The wooden houses, no matter how thickly built, were monuments to freezing, exposing 6 broad sides to the endless assault of the wind, leaking heat into the void as quickly as the desperate families could generate it. It was within this harsh, unforgiving context that the old Miller Tract sat abandoned, a scarred patch of earth on a rising ridge just 3 miles north of the town of Oak Haven. Decades earlier, a man named Miller had attempted to break the sod and build a life on that ridge. He had constructed a large, imposing timber frame house, a structure the town had initially admired for its scale and ambition. But the ridge was completely exposed, a geographical anvil upon which the winter storms hammered without mercy. Miller had fought the cold for 3 brutal winters, burning his fences, his outbuildings, and finally his own furniture in a vain attempt to keep the biting frost at bay. When the spring thaw finally arrived in his 3rd year, the town found Miller broken in spirit and nearly starved, his grand house a hollow, drafty shell. He packed what little he had left and abandoned the claim, leaving behind a ruined foundation and a legacy of failure. The town of Oak Haven quickly deemed the tract cursed, a fool's errand for anyone who thought they could tame that particular stretch of wind-battered stone and thin topsoil. For years, the property remained untouched, the timber rotting away, the stone foundation sinking back into the prairie grass, serving only as a cautionary tale for new arrivals who asked about the barren ridge on the horizon. When the county finally decided to auction the derelict property to recoup years of unpaid taxes, no one in Oak Haven expected a serious bidder. The auction was held on a damp, gray morning in late October, the kind of day that whispered of the long, dark winter to come. The townspeople gathered in the muddy street outside the assayer's office, their breath pluming in the crisp air, treating the event more as a social gathering than a legitimate business transaction. Mr. Abernathy, the county clerk, stood on a wooden crate and read the description of the Miller Tract with a tone of weary obligation. He asked for an opening bid of $100, fully expecting the silence that followed. He lowered it to $80, then to $50, the crowd shifting restlessly, a few men chuckling at the absurdity of paying good money for a patch of cursed dirt. It was then that Elias Thorne stepped forward from the back of the crowd. Elias was a quiet man, an immigrant who had arrived in Oak Haven only a few months prior, carrying little more than a canvas rucksack and a set of heavy steel masonry tools. He was a man of medium build, but his hands were like walnuts, thick and gnarled from a lifetime of shaping stone and earth. He did not speak often, and when he did, it was with a measured, deliberate cadence that made the fast-talking merchants of the town impatient. Elias walked to the front of the crowd, the mud squelching beneath his heavy leather boots. He reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch. He did not shout his bid, but spoke directly to Mr. Abernathy in a voice that was barely louder than the rustling wind. He offered $40 for the entirety of the Miller Tract. A ripple of laughter moved through the gathered townsfolk. Silas Vance, the owner of the local lumber mill and the man who considered himself the unofficial patriarch of Oak Haven, leaned against the hitching post and shook his head. Vance was a pragmatic man, a man who believed in the tangible power of sawn timber and heavy industry, and he viewed Elias's purchase as an act of profound ignorance. He called out to Elias, asking if he intended to farm the wind or mine the frost, drawing a louder chorus of laughter from the crowd. Elias did not rise to the mockery. He simply waited, his eyes fixed on the clerk, until the gavel fell and the deed was signed. He handed over 40 heavy silver dollars, turned his back on the amused whispers of the community, and began the long walk out to the ridge. The town collectively dismissed him as a fool, a man who would either freeze to death before January or abandon the claim just as Miller had done before him. In the days that followed, the people of Oak Haven expected to see Elias Thorne at the lumberyard, purchasing the heavy timber necessary to build a conventional cabin before the snows arrived. They expected to see him hiring wagons to haul massive loads of cut wood to the ridge. Instead, Elias purchased nothing but a new shovel, a heavy iron pickaxe, and a large quantity of quicklime. He spent his days on the exposed ridge, but he did not build upward. He began to dig. The town watched from afar, their amusement slowly turning to bewilderment. Why would a man waste his precious time and energy digging in the frozen earth when he needed a roof over his head? The conventional wisdom of the prairie dictated that the earth was a cold, dead thing, a frozen barrier that must be overcome, not embraced. But Elias possessed a different kind of knowledge, an old-world understanding of thermal dynamics and the deep, silent rhythms of the earth. He knew that the town's perception of the ground was entirely backward. The surface of the earth was indeed subject to the violent extremes of the weather, freezing in the winter and baking in the summer. But below the frost line, the earth was a massive, unchanging battery, maintaining a constant temperature of roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Elias had recognized something when he first inspected the ruins of the Miller cabin. Beneath the rotting floorboards and the collapsed stone chimney, he had noticed a subtle depression in the earth, a sinking of the soil that suggested a void beneath. While Miller had built his grand house on top of the ground, fighting the elements, Elias understood that true shelter on this barren ridge required retreating into the embrace of the earth itself. As he swung his pickaxe and drove his shovel into the rocky soil, he was not merely digging a basement, he was excavating a forgotten cellar, a deep, natural depression that Miller had completely ignored. The work was brutal, backbreaking labor. The topsoil was thin, giving way quickly to dense, compacted clay and layers of stubborn limestone. Elias worked from before dawn until long after the sun had set, his breath hanging in the frigid air, the rhythmic thud of his tools echoing across the empty prairie. He moved tons of earth by hand, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, slowly revealing a massive subterranean cavity that stretched deep into the ridge. As the hole grew deeper, the true genius of Elias's plan began to take shape, though it remained entirely invisible to the skeptics in the town below. He was not simply digging a cave to hide in. He was engineering a highly sophisticated passive geothermal heating system, relying on principles that had been utilized by the ancient Romans and forgotten by the modern world. At a depth of 12 feet, well below the deepest reach of the winter frost, Elias leveled the floor of the cavern. The air down here was profoundly still, insulated from the howling wind above, and it held a steady damp coolness that felt remarkably mild compared to the biting chill of the autumn surface. He began to gather the scattered fieldstone from the ruined Miller foundation, carrying the heavy rocks down into the excavation. With meticulous precision, he began to lay out a labyrinth of shallow trenches across the floor of the cellar, lining them with the stone. These trenches were not for water, but for air. He was constructing a hypocaust, a system designed to circulate heat through the very structure of the home. Elias understood that the greatest enemy of warmth was not just the cold air, but the rapid loss of heat through uninsulated surfaces. The conventional wooden homes in Oak Haven relied on a central iron stove that burned incredibly hot, creating a small sphere of intense heat that quickly dissipated as it rushed upward and out through the thin walls and roof. The air near the ceiling would be stifling, while water would freeze in buckets on the floor. Elias's design turned this dynamic completely upside down. He constructed a massive heavy masonry stove in the center of the subterranean space, built not of thin iron, but of thick, dense fire brick and mortar. This stove was not designed to burn hot and fast. It was engineered to burn slow, capturing the energy of the fire and storing it within the thermal mass of the stone. The exhaust from the fire did not simply travel straight up a chimney to the outside air. Instead, Elias forced the hot smoke and gases to travel through a serpentine series of horizontal channels built into the heavy stone walls of the stove, before finally venting to the surface. This principle of thermal mass was the key to his survival strategy. As the fire burned, the dense stone of the masonry stove would absorb the heat, slowly rising in temperature over many hours. Long after the fire had died down to mere embers, the massive stone structure would continue to radiate a gentle, even warmth into the surrounding space. But Elias did not stop there. He connected the intake of this masonry stove to the labyrinth of stone-lined trenches beneath the floor. And from those trenches, he ran a long, heavy clay pipe entirely underground, extending horizontally for more than 100 yards away from the dwelling, gradually sloping upward until it breached the surface in a small protected copse of scrub oak. This was his geothermal draft tube. When the fire in the stove drew in air for combustion, it did not pull freezing air directly from the outside, nor did it create cold drafts across the floor of the living space as conventional stoves did. Instead, it pulled fresh air from the distant surface, dragging it slowly through the 100 yards of buried clay pipe. As the freezing outside air traveled through the deep earth, it absorbed the ambient heat of the soil. By the time this air reached the living space, it had been naturally pre-warmed from below zero to a mild 50 degrees, entirely through the passive exchange of geothermal energy. It was an elegant, silent, and incredibly efficient system that required no moving parts, no mechanical intervention, and only a fraction of the firewood needed to heat a conventional home. The earth itself was doing the heavy lifting, serving as both insulation and a heat exchanger. Once the intricate floor system and the masonry heater were complete, Elias began to construct the roof. He did not build high walls. He laid heavy timber beams across the top of the excavation, essentially capping the deep cellar flush with the natural slope of the ridge. He then covered these beams with thick layers of straw, clay, and finally feet of the very earth he had excavated, seeding it with native prairie grass. From a distance, the old Miller tract looked exactly as it had before, a barren ridge sweeping up toward the sky. The only signs of human habitation were a small, heavy oak door set deep into a stone retaining wall on the leeward side of the slope, and a low, modest stone chimney that barely peaked above the grass. Elias had essentially erased his home from the horizon, removing it from the path of the wind. He had created a sanctuary that existed in harmony with the extreme environment rather than standing in arrogant defiance of it. But the town of Oak Haven, blind to the intricate engineering buried beneath the soil, saw only a man who had chosen to live like an animal in a hole. As November arrived and the first hard frosts hardened the mud of the town streets, the mockery at the general store grew more pointed. Men gathered around the glowing iron stove, warming their hands and making jokes about Elias Thorne, the mole of Miller's Ridge. Silas Vance, driven by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a genuine, if misplaced, sense of civic duty, decided to ride out to the ridge one gray afternoon. He wrapped himself in a heavy buffalo coat, mounted his strongest horse, and braved the biting wind that was already beginning to carry the sharp sting of ice. When he arrived at the property, he found Elias quietly staking a modest pile of split wood near the sunken entrance of his home. The pile was shockingly small, barely enough to last a conventional household a week in deep winter. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, and approached the retaining wall. He looked at the low oak door and the earth-covered roof, shaking his head in disbelief. He told Elias that there was no shame in admitting a mistake. He offered to hire Elias at the lumber mill, to give him an advance on his wages so he could rent a proper room in town before the real winter hit. He warned the quiet immigrant that the prairie wind was a killer and that a hole in the ground would become a frozen tomb when the blizzards came. Elias paused in his work, resting his thick hands on a piece of split oak. He looked at Silas, his expression entirely neutral, devoid of anger or defensiveness. He thanked the mill owner for his concern, but politely declined the offer. He stated simply that the earth was warm and that the heat would go up while the cold would pass over. Silas scoffed at the cryptic response. He pointed to the small woodpile, asking how Elias intended to keep a fire burning through January with such a meager supply. Elias explained in his slow, deliberate cadence that he did not need to fight the cold, only to maintain the warmth that the earth already provided. Silas, a man who understood the world only through the lens of brute force and constant consumption, found the explanation absurd. He mounted his horse, wrapping his coat tighter against a sudden violent gust of wind, and told Elias that he would send the undertaker in the spring. As Silas rode away, Elias simply turned back to his woodpile, the quiet rhythm of his labor unbroken by the wealthy man's dire predictions. The true test of Elias's ingenuity and the catastrophic failure of Oak Haven's conventional wisdom arrived in the second week of January. It began not with a dramatic roar, but with a subtle, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The barometric pressure plummeted so rapidly that the older men in town felt it as a physical ache in their joints. The sky bruised to a deep, unnatural purple, and the ever-present wind suddenly died, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the prairie. The animals sensed it first. The horses kicked nervously in their stalls, and the stray dogs vanished beneath the boardwalks. Then the temperature began to fall. It did not drop steadily, it plunged, plummeting past zero, past 10 below, plunging toward a bone-shattering 40 degrees below zero. And then the wind returned. But this was not the standard gale of the high plains. This was the Great Whiteout, a massive swirling vortex of microscopic ice crystals driven by wind gusts that exceeded 70 miles an hour. The storm hit Oak Haven with the force of a physical blow. The air turned entirely opaque, a blinding, howling whiteness that erased the world beyond an arm's reach. The sheer velocity of the wind drove the ice crystals into every crack, every seam, and every keyhole of the wooden houses. Inside the grand timber homes, the reality of the crisis set in with terrifying speed. The residents stoked their iron stoves until the metal glowed cherry red, feeding load after load of precious wood into the hungry flames. But the heat was instantly stripped away. The violent wind created a vacuum effect on the leeward side of the structures, literally sucking the warm air out through the walls and replacing it with the absolute zero of the storm. Families huddled in the center of their living rooms, wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching in horror as the frost crept across their interior walls. Water buckets sitting mere feet from the roaring stoves froze solid. The cold was no longer just an absence of heat, it was an aggressive, penetrating force that threatened to stop the heart and freeze the blood in their veins. In the massive two-story home of Silas Vance, the situation was rapidly becoming desperate. Silas had built his house as a testament to his wealth and standing, with high ceilings, broad windows, and sprawling rooms. Now, that very architecture was betraying him. The enormous volume of air inside the house was impossible to keep warm. Despite burning through a cord of wood in a single day, the temperature in the parlor was hovering just above freezing, and the upstairs bedrooms were completely uninhabitable. Silas's wife and children were huddled together beneath a pile of heavy quilts on the floor near the stove, shivering uncontrollably. The wind shrieked around the eaves, a deafening continuous roar that sounded like 1,000 tearing sheets of metal. Silas paced the floor, his mind racing. His wood supply, which he had thought would last until March, was vanishing at an alarming rate. If the storm lasted for 3 days, as these blizzards often did, they would run out of fuel. And without fuel in this wooden box exposed to the fury of the storm, they would die. As the second night of the blizzard fell, plunging the whiteout into a terrifying howling darkness, Silas realized he had to make a choice. He could stay and watch his family freeze as the last of the wood turned to ash, or he could risk the impossible. He thought of the old Miller tract. He thought of Elias Thorne, the quiet man in the hole in the ground. Silas had assumed Elias was already dead, buried beneath the drifting snow, but a desperate, irrational hope began to take root in his mind. What if the immigrant was right? What if the earth truly was a sanctuary? Silas knew that the ridge was only 3 miles away, but in this storm, 3 miles was a journey across the surface of a frozen hell. He made his decision. He wrapped his family in layers of wool and heavy canvas, tied a guide rope around his waist, and secured the other end to his wife. They stepped out the back door and were instantly swallowed by the shrieking void. The journey from the town to the ridge was an exercise in pure agony. The wind physically pushed them backward, tearing at their clothes and stealing the breath from their lungs. The cold was a physical weight, numbing their extremities within minutes. Silas navigated entirely by blind instinct and the faint, intermittent memory of the fence lines. They fell repeatedly, floundering in snowdrifts that were suddenly chest-high. Every step required a monumental effort of will. Silas's mind began to fog, the seductive lethargy of hypothermia whispering to him to just lie down and rest. But the tug of the rope, the physical connection to his family, forced him to keep moving. After what felt like hours, the ground began to slope upward. They had reached the ridge, but the landscape was unrecognizable, transformed into a smooth, featureless dune of hard-packed snow. The wind screamed over the rise, unimpeded. Silas fell to his knees, his hope shattering. There was no house, there was no smoke, there was only the endless white. Frantically, Silas began to crawl along the leeward side of the slope, searching blindly with his heavy, frost-bitten mittens. He was looking for the stone retaining wall, the only vertical feature that might have survived the drifting. His hands brushed against something hard. He dug wildly, clearing the snow to reveal the rough texture of fieldstone. He followed the wall down, his heart pounding a weak, desperate rhythm against his ribs. And then, his hands found the heavy oak door. It was completely buried, sealed behind a wall of packed drift. Silas threw his body against the snow, digging with the frantic energy of a dying man. He cleared enough space to grasp the heavy iron ring of the latch. He pulled with all his remaining strength. The door was heavy, built with thick timbers and sealed tightly against the frame, but it swung inward, opening into absolute darkness. Silas dragged his wife and children over the threshold, pulling the heavy door shut behind them, sealing out the deafening roar of the storm. The transition was so sudden, so profound, that for a moment Silas thought he had died and passed into another world. The howling of the wind, which had been a physical pressure against his eardrums for 2 days, was completely gone. In its place was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. But it was the temperature that truly shocked him. As they lay exhausted on the hard floor, Silas realized he was not freezing. The air in the darkness was not just survivable, it was overwhelmingly, beautifully warm. It was a gentle, pervasive heat that seemed to radiate from every surface, wrapping around them like a physical blanket. He fumbled with his frozen fingers, striking a match. The small flare of light illuminated a scene that defied every law of survival Silas had ever known. They were in a small, stone-lined entryway. Before them stood a second door, which was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, Silas entered the main living space of Elias Thorne's subterranean home. The room was bathed in a soft golden light from a single oil lamp resting on a sturdy wooden table. The air was incredibly fresh, lacking the stifling, smoky quality of the houses in town. In the center of the room stood the massive masonry heater, its thick stone walls radiating a steady, powerful warmth. There was no roaring fire visible, only a small, calm bed of glowing coals behind a small iron door. Elias Thorne sat in a comfortable chair beside the table, a book resting on his knee. He looked up as the desperate, snow-covered family stumbled into his home. He did not look surprised. He simply closed his book, stood up, and moved to a small cupboard. He returned with a stack of heavy wool blankets and a kettle of water, which he placed on the flat top of the masonry stove. Silas Vance, a man who had spent his life issuing orders and commanding respect, collapsed into a chair, his body trembling violently as the deep chill began to thaw from his bones. He looked around the room, taking in the smooth clay walls, the heavy timber ceiling, and the intricate stone floor. The temperature in the room had to be nearly 70 degrees, a tropical paradise compared to the lethal void just a few feet above their heads. He watched as Elias calmly poured warm water into mugs and handed them to his shivering children. Silas looked at the small wood box next to the stove. It held no more than a dozen split logs. He thought of the cords of wood he had burned in 2 days, fighting a losing battle against the wind. He looked at Elias, the man he had mocked, the man he had called a fool. His voice was hoarse, broken by the cold and the profound weight of his realization. He asked Elias how it was possible. How could this small fire keep this entire cavern so incredibly warm, while the great houses of Oakhaven were freezing from the inside out? Elias sat back down in his chair, his hands resting quietly on his lap. He explained the principles once more, not with arrogance but with the patient tone of a teacher. He explained how the earth above them was a perfect insulator, holding the heat in and keeping the wind out. He explained how the massive stone stove absorbed the energy of the small fire, storing it and releasing it slowly over many hours, rather than letting it escape up a chimney. And he explained the draft tube, the long buried pipe that drew fresh air through the deep earth, warming it before it ever entered the room. He told Silas that he had only added 3 pieces of wood to the fire since the storm began. The system did not fight the environment, it worked with it. It utilized the constant hidden energy of the earth to create a sustainable microclimate. Silas listened in stunned silence, the sheer elegance and simplicity of the engineering washing over him. He realized that his entire understanding of building, of survival, of man's relationship with nature had been fundamentally wrong. He had relied on brute force, while this quiet immigrant had relied on principle and profound observation. For the next 3 days, the Great Whiteout raged across the Dakota Territory, burying the landscape under feet of hard-packed snow and claiming the lives of countless livestock and unprepared settlers. But beneath the Miller Tract, in the quiet, earth-sheltered sanctuary of Elias Thorne, the Vance family survived in absolute comfort. They ate simple meals, they slept deeply in the enveloping warmth, and they listened to the faint, distant rumble of the storm that could not reach them. When the wind finally died and the sky cleared to a brilliant freezing blue, Silas and Elias dug their way out through the entryway. They emerged into a transformed world, a blinding expanse of white that had erased the horizon. The town of Oakhaven had survived, but barely. The people were exhausted, traumatized, and nearly out of fuel. When Silas Vance returned to town, leading his healthy, warm family, the community was shocked. They had assumed the wealthy mill owner had perished in the storm, and they were certain the immigrant on the ridge was dead. Silas did not return to his grand, freezing wooden house immediately. He went straight to the general store, where the shivering men of the town were gathered around the last of their coal. He stood before them, a changed man. He did not speak of his own bravery or his harrowing journey. He spoke of Elias Thorne. He described in exacting detail the subterranean home, the masonry heater, and the geothermal draft tube. He admitted his own ignorance loudly and publicly, declaring that the quiet immigrant they had all mocked possessed more practical wisdom than the entire town combined. He told them that the era of building wooden boxes to fight the wind was over. He announced that as soon as the spring thaw arrived, he would be tearing down his massive timber house and hiring Elias Thorne to design and build an earth-sheltered home, utilizing the deep thermal mass of the prairie soil. The shift in Oakhaven's perspective was not instantaneous, but the survival of the Vance family was an undeniable testament to the validity of Elias's methods. Throughout the remainder of that brutal winter, as firewood grew scarce and the cold persisted, several other desperate families made the trek to the Miller Tract, seeking temporary refuge in the warm, quiet earth. Elias turned no one away, his small subterranean home serving as a silent rebuke to the flawed conventional wisdom of the surface. When the spring finally broke the grip of the frost, Elias Thorne was no longer a mocked outsider. He was the most sought-after builder in the territory. He taught the men of Oakhaven how to dig deep, how to lay the stone channels for the hypocaust systems, and how to build the massive, slow-burning masonry heaters. The town slowly transformed, the tall, vulnerable wooden structures giving way to low, earth-burned homes that nestled into the landscape, drawing their warmth from the deep, unchanging battery of the earth. The story of Elias Thorne and the abandoned homestead is a profound reminder that true ingenuity often lies not in conquering nature through brute force, but in understanding its underlying principles and working in harmony with them. The conventional wisdom of the crowd is frequently loud, arrogant, and ultimately fragile when tested by extreme circumstances. It relies on the visible, the immediate, and the resource-intensive. In contrast, the quiet, methodical application of forgotten physical principles such as thermal mass, passive geothermal exchange, and earth sheltering demonstrates the triumph of profound observation over superficial tradition. Elias did not invent the thermodynamics of the earth, he simply possessed the wisdom to recognize them and the discipline to apply them when everyone else was busy laughing. This narrative serves as a historical exploration of early passive heating techniques and survival strategies, illustrating how old-world knowledge can solve seemingly intractable environmental challenges. It is essential to note that this story is a historically inspired reconstruction intended for educational and storytelling purposes. It does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice. The specific techniques described, such as subterranean excavation and the construction of unvented or uniquely vented masonry heaters, involve significant inherent risks, including structural collapse, carbon monoxide poisoning, and inadequate ventilation if not properly engineered. Any modern application of earth-sheltered building, passive geothermal systems, or thermal mass heating must strictly adhere to current municipal building codes, environmental regulations, and contemporary safety guidelines, and should only be undertaken with the consultation of licensed professionals. The true lesson of Oakhaven is not merely to dig a hole, but to look beneath the surface of accepted wisdom, to question the loud consensus, and to recognize that sometimes the most sophisticated solutions are hidden quietly in the earth beneath our feet, waiting for someone with the patience to uncover them.